Hello and welcome to the Deep Dive Perspective. We're going to look at something very, very fascinating for people who are focusing on the issue of Palestine, on the issue of Jewry, and the issue of Judaism and its connection with West Asia. Of course, it's become such a huge issue today that nobody in the world is unaware of the implications of what's going on in the occupied Palestine, and nobody's also unaware of the impact it potentially has on the broader diaspora of Jewish fraternity around the world. But the origins of this whole issue go back, of course, to the early part of the 20th century and even earlier. Zionism itself, it's argued, hijacked the Jewish community and in fact hijacked the Jewish identity for its own political purposes to create a state which is, to my mind and to many people's mind, illegitimate in its origins. But those who went from Europe after persecutions, after wars, after all of the kind of the Holocaust, etc., that had gone on within Europe itself, Germany specifically, of course, they obviously are also people with a story, and it's clear that that story is often framed and told in a way which suits Israel, I think, and it suits the narrative of a lot of the kind of hasbara, I could argue. However, there are real stories that we need to hear, and some of those stories of the people on the ground really will give us, I think, a more honest and fascinating look at not only the origins of Israel as we know it, but also the issues, the really human issues faced by people who would have been those early settlers, the early people from Europe, Jewish fraternity, who arrived there in Palestine. And with me, with a fascinating personal story, is Professor Haim Bresheeth, who himself is an Israeli citizen, albeit possibly persona non gratis, because he's gone from being an IDF officer in his youth and actually spent the rest of his life becoming a Palestinian activist, a pro-Palestine activist, and indeed an anti-Zionist. A fascinating journey which intrigues me because it begins in places like Auschwitz, and it begins with his family. Welcome to the show, Professor Haim. I've given a broad overview, and you'll correct me if I got anything wrong in there. But this journey that often people don't know very much about, because it goes back into the mists of time and people can barely remember what happened yesterday. But it's very important because that journey of the Jewish fraternity from Europe now can get framed as a blame game against those immigrants. It can also be used as a sort of a weapon for creating the notion of anti-Semitism if people object to any of that narrative. But for you, it's not just a narrative, it's a very personal family experience. Your mother and father were in Germany. Tell me a little bit about your family's story and its connection with Europe, Israel, and beyond.
In a sense, my family is at the nub of this issue because both my parents' family was divided unequally. My mother's family was more Zionist. My father's family was anti-Zionist. And these two people who grew up together, they were first cousins. They grew up together in a small modern town in Poland, a steel town, very unusually. A Jewish steel town where Jews were 80% of the population. They were working class on the whole. They were progressive. They had a party which was a socialist party called the Bund. And the Socialist Bund was the second largest party in Poland. So it was a very, very large party with tens of deputies in the Sejm, the parliament in Poland, and quite a lot of influence of Jewish matters and others on the left. So like any other family, this division between Zionists and anti-Zionists was very typical. In a sense, you could say that the 6 million Jews or so that died in the Holocaust, they were a minority of the people that died in the Holocaust, by the way. The Holocaust probably was the end of 28 million people, most of them in Russia, in Belarus, and in Ukraine, yeah, and in Poland, yeah. So people talk about 6 million Jews dying in the Holocaust, but they don't tell us about the other citizens who died in the Holocaust. But basically, those 6 million Jews were mainly anti-Zionist. So in a sense, the Zionism was boosted by the killing of 6 million anti-Zionists, give or take. Wow. Most of them were indeed anti-Zionist. Now, we lived, I didn't live there, but the family lived in a place called Ostrovets, which was 15 miles from another small town called Oswiecim, which then became what we know today as Auschwitz. So these were connected by a line, a train line, and my parents, like any other Jew in town, were put into a ghetto in 1940 and lived there more or less for 5.5 years. And the ghetto was, the Israelis call it mowing the lawn. That's the kind of language used by the Nazis. They were mowing the lawn in the ghetto, like any other ghetto, all the time, sending people to the concentration camps, but to the death camps mainly. Most of the two families died in 1943 in Treblinka. Treblinka was a death camp without another part of the camp. Yeah, in Auschwitz, people also worked. That's what happened to my parents. In Treblinka, the minute you had 20 minutes to leave, to leave after you arrived. That was the kind of time passage that people waited to die. So most of the family was killed there. And then my parents both worked in military industry in the ghetto. And in 44, in June 44, to be accurate, they were taken to Auschwitz. And they survived there almost a year, which is a very long time to survive in Auschwitz. Because they were young and strong, they were selected to work, and they worked in Auschwitz I, which was the main camp. There was a work camp. There were all the military industries of the largest companies that you can find in Germany today. Yeah, so these companies held war industries in Auschwitz and in many other camps, and that's where my father, for example, worked on producing Messerschmitt parts for airplanes. They were, of course. Auschwitz was not a family camp, and it wasn't a holiday camp. But my father used to say, in comparison to what happened later in the camp that he ended up after Auschwitz was freed, Auschwitz was a good camp, yeah, because you only got bread once a day and some kind of gruel, but you always got it. The Germans were very organized. We know that about the Nazi regime. So you didn't eat a lot, but you were fed, which is more than we can say about the Palestinians in Gaza, for example. So this is to be taken into account. They survived. They actually, my father was married to another cousin of his in 41, and she died in Treblinka in 43. And both he and my mother and the rest of the family, the surviving members, were taken to Auschwitz. And he only saw my mother once in the year that they spent in Auschwitz. Oh. And it was when he held a piece of bread that he just got. And there was an electrified fence between the men and the women. So he saw her and she saw him. They were about 20 yards. He took the bread and threw it and said, give it to Mahla Rabner. And she got what was left of it. Everyone took a tax. Can you blame them?
No. Yeah.
But she said the little piece that she got was more important than eating, because she knew that he's alive. Mm-hmm. And they were there until the 15th of January 1945. I remember my father telling me that what he wanted more than anything, because they saw the Allies bombers passing on the way to bombing Ploiești, where the Nazi oil came from in Romania, and they said, "Please bomb us, end this production of death." Yeah, but they never stopped, and they never bombed any of the camps, which is an interesting question for some other time. Now, the Nazis ran away from Auschwitz the same morning that they saw the Russian forces of the Red Army cross the Bug, the river Bug. And it was a question of a couple of hours and they would be in Auschwitz. So in 5 minutes, the whole of Auschwitz was emptied of Nazis. And people didn't know what to do. The Russians came, made a lot of film footage out of this. This was not shown in the West, but it was shown in Eastern Europe. Even before the end of the war, it was shown that the liberation of Auschwitz, there were 6,000 men and 4,000 women that were left out of the normal population of Auschwitz was 250,000.
Wow.
That 250,000 would not be the same week by week. Yeah, they will
come and
go, one in, one out, as they say now. So basically, towards the end of the war, they were not able to bring new people because there were no more Jews left. So at the end of Auschwitz run, there were only those 10,000 people. They left in 2 large Fußmarsches, in other words, death marches, on foot. The women to Germany, to Bergen-Belsen, and the men to Mauthausen in Austria. And of course, in both cases, more than half died on the road.
So who was taking them there on this Fußmarsch?
The SS.
Okay.
The SS was very worried that live Jews will be captured by either the Americans or the Russians, and therefore they took them to those camps. And they made the camps, interestingly, and both my father and mother made the camps. Of course, there was no food on the road, so most people died. It was quite cold as well. January in Eastern Europe, snow. They were dressed with this pyjama. They didn't have any other clothes. My mother made it to Bergen-Belsen, where she immediately got typhoid. Most of the people in Bergen-Belsen did not die by gas. They died from diseases. It wasn't, an extermination camp. So most of people died in typhoid in 1945. And she was saved by a British woman doctor that came there in April with the forces. She was filmed also, and we have one image of her.
And she was separate from your father. This is two different areas.
The men and the women were totally separate all the time. And my father ended up in a sub-camp of Mauthausen called Gusen II, which the Nazis dubbed as the hell of hells, because they thought it's the worst place that their imagination could create. Basically, it was 11 tunnels that were dug into the mountain of Mauthausen. It's a very beautiful place, by the way. If you go to Austria, there is a beautiful lake called Ebensee, or the Sea of Eben, the Lake of Eben, and a mountain. And the camp is at the bottom of the mountain. And they dug 11 tunnels into the mountain so that the production of aeroplanes could continue in better conditions than in Swinemunde, which is in the north of Germany, which the RAF was getting to and destroying.
So this was more protected by mountains, so they could produce.
Now, they used those, not only Jews, Russian prisoners of war. There were about half Russian, half Jewish prisoners. And they used them because they tried to use horses, and it wasn't working. It was too expensive to feed the horses.
Right.
Horses you cannot starve, and they were expensive. So it was easier to take those people that were almost unlimited supply, and they worked as horses. They carried. There was a line, and they carried the parts on little trolleys. And the pictures of my father and his colleagues on the Liberation Day is they're totally naked, and they have those leather tongs that tied them to the trolleys to take them in and out, day and night. So my father was 32 kilos when he was freed. My mother was 31 kilos. This was totally typical because it wasn't, they didn't have as much food to give them at all, because it was the end of the war. So they hardly fed them. And the normal length of life in Gusen II of any of the inmates was 10 days. Somehow my father survived there until the 8th of May, when the Americans came. And we have pictures which are now, it's the main picture when you enter the museum in Mauthausen. Is a very large image, and it's my father and two of his friends heating bully boof can on an open fire that they got from the Americans. And as my father told me, the other two were dead the same day, because if you eat bully boof after, when you're 32 kilos, you die. Somehow he was very ill, but he didn't die. So most of the people continued to die because the Americans fed them what they had. We're not to blame them, I don't think, but that's what they did. My father, when he kind of got to some kind of normality in a few weeks, started to walk towards Italy, because he heard that from Italy you can get to Palestine. Now, he was no Zionist ever, and actually, as it turned out, he was an opponent later on. I'll mention this, but he didn't have anywhere to go. He tried to get a visa to the United States because we had family in the United States. The only place we had family was the United States and Cuba, but he didn't have any details about the Cuba people.
But the Palestine issue, was that advertised? Were they being given the opportunity by some sort of agencies? Is that how he found out?
Yeah, I mean, the Zionist program in the camps was very advanced. They sent what is called shlichim, which is messengers in Hebrew, and they went to all the camps. They were preparing the war. This was 1945. They were preparing the war in Palestine. They needed young people to fight. Right. It was a very small base that they had in Palestine.
So even during the Second World War, there were plans, you think, that were...
Yeah, in the Second World War, they tried to get people from Europe. It wasn't very successful. Some of those boats sank with all the people. So people that actually saved themselves one way or another ended up at the bottom of the sea because the ships were not really any good. One ship was actually called Patria, was blown up by the Haganah in the port in Haifa, and 600 people died. And they did that in order to create, an echo.
So the Haganah, the precursor to the IDF, Israeli Defense Force, but perhaps the Stern Gang, etc. as well, which is a fascinating period of history which very few people know about. But I'm interested to see how the connections of the Zionist movement would have been able to prepare the plan for Palestine in terms of the war, as you put it, or the struggle that they would have seen it as in Nazi Germany. I mean, the Zionists, I've read some places, and I don't know, I'm not an expert on that period of history, but it seems as though the Zionists had relations with Hitler, and they had relations with the Nazis, and that the Germans under Hitler were quite happy with the idea of Jews being in Palestine as well. What's your understanding? What's your take on all that?
We probably don't have a time to talk about it properly, but there was a plan that the Zionists worked out in the early 30s, and it was activated after the Nazis came to power. Within weeks of the Nazis coming to power, the Haganah sent an envoy to Berlin to sign an agreement with the Nazis. Now, the Nazis did not sign agreements in the 30s with any state, and they did not allow any flag of any states apart from their own flag to fly in Berlin. The only flag that did was what was then to become the flag of Israel, the flag of the Haganah, because they signed an agreement that included that detail. So that's the only organization they signed an agreement with. They signed it in 1933 in the summer because there was an enormous lack of valuta, of foreign currency. The Nazis were basically boycotted by a lot of people and a lot of states. And Jews led the boycott against the Nazis. So there was a shortage of dollars, and they couldn't buy things that were important, also food, So the Zionists came and suggested to them a solution for both problems, to end the boycott and to bring money. They said, you don't want the Jews, we need them. You are short of money, we'll give it to you. And they worked out something called a transfer agreement. In other words, there were 350,000 Jews in Germany and a similar number, a bit less, in Austria. And those two were now one regime. So there's more than 500,000 Jews to sell. And they were buying. So the agreement simply was the Jews, the minute the Nazis came to power, the crisis of valuta was so bad that no German could leave with a penny. You couldn't take any money,
I see.
any money of any description out of Germany. So if you wanted to leave, but without anything, you just the shirt on your back.
Right.
So a lot of Jews waited to see if they could find an arrangement to get some of the money out. And there the Zionists came and offered it. And that was a very simple agreement. Jews could leave only to Palestine if they wanted to take their money. If they wanted to go somewhere else, like the United States, and got a visa, which is almost impossible, you leave without a penny.
That would mean that even the Jews who were anti-Zionists, who you talk about, would have had an incentive to say, oh, look, let's get the hell out of here, because at least we can save our...
Now, and the money was divided between the Nazi party, not the Nazi state, but the Nazi party, the Zionists, and the owner of the money. In other words, about a third, and a third.
So there was a tax.
Yeah, it was a tax. Everyone was gaining, apart from the owners. Yeah.
Sure.
So if you wanted to take any money, in other words, a third of your capital, you can go only to Palestine, and you would only get it in Palestine, and you would not get it in money, like dollars because they didn't have any dollars. You will get it in German goods.
Oh.
So that was a breaking of the boycott. Where no other place would buy from Germany, from Nazi Germany. Here are the Zionists saying we are breaking the boycott against Germany. We're getting Jews there, and they bring and the beginning of the arms industry in Palestine, the Jewish arms industry, is the machinery that was brought out as part of the transfer agreement.
So your father would have been, he'd have been aware of this possibility of getting to Palestine?
He didn't have that possibility because he lived in Poland.
Ah, I see.
So that was only for the German Jews and the Austrian Jews.
Okay.
But he didn't want to go. He didn't want to leave Poland. The people who voted for the Bund, which was 90% of the Jews in Poland, thought of themselves as Polish. They might have been secular, or they might have been ultra-religious, but they were Polish.
Right.
Okay? That's how they considered themselves. Only less than 10%, few, like 2 or 3% of Polish Jews left to go to Palestine. So, my parents survived in a terrible state without anything, even a single picture, a single document. Nothing survived. Yeah, they were just alone in the world, like the people of Gaza now. They tried to go to the United States. The Americans wouldn't give them a visa because your family, had to support you financially. The family, for reasons which we never found out, did not agree to do that, and so they couldn't get a visa. It says something about families anyway. So in the end, after 3 years in Rome, they ended up on a boat just 10 days after the war in Palestine started. They wouldn't go before it was illegal, and the British would take them to Cyprus if they caught them entering illegally. But then it was legal. The boats were legit. They were Israeli boats. And on the boat, people were trained to fight, arms training, etc. My father refused to join the training. He said, I have seen so much death and destruction and blood. I'm not going to kill anyone. I don't want to be killed. I'm not going to fight. I'm not doing that. So he was arrested on arrival. We arrived, 2 weeks after the war started or so. He was arrested on arrival. And they said to him, if you are not going to be drafted, you'll spend your life in jail. Now, of course, this was not true, because actually the punishment was 3 years in jail, but he wasn't to know that.
Sure.
In the end, By the way, while he was in jail, my mother and I were in another jail. I was, 18
So how old
months
were
old.
you about this?
I was 18 months old.
Okay.
So we were put into a British jail that became a holding place for people who came from the camps. People from the camps were very important. They were young and they would fight. So, nobody old survived in the camps. It was kind of like the rule of the game. After 6 weeks, my father was broken. He agreed to be drafted as an unarmed medic. And he served as an unarmed medic, and somehow he survived.
Was it called the Haganah at that time?
No, it was called the IDF, by the way.
By that time, it was IDF.
From the minute the state existed, they collected those three militias into the IDF.
So the Irgun, the Haganah, and what's the other one?
The Irgun, the Haganah, and the Sterngang.
Oh, right. Yeah. Menachem Begin was
Irgun. He was the leader of
and he was part of the. From what I little I know, the King David Hotel.
Yeah.
Which was bombed. Sure. He was actually on the operations team.
The Haganah was involved as well. They didn't do it, but they advised and they supported the Irgun in doing it.
It was literally a kind of an organized movement which was sent from Europe mostly and was designed to militarily take over that territory.
It was more than that. I mean, it was the first institution of the state to be. So the state in waiting in 1920, 28 years before, created the organizations of state that they needed. The first one was Haganah.
I see.
So that tells you what they wanted to do.
There was a preparation.
Yeah? This was a modern army. In the 30s, it was very influenced by the Nazi unit, the Schutzstaffel, the SS, and the Wehrmacht, and also by, Ord Wingate, who was a British officer, very sadistic, who trained the first night raids. They operated at night. So they were, in a sense, a further development of what was happening in Germany and in Britain in preparing the Second World War.
It seems strange to me that you have, on the one hand, this Zionist movement, which clearly has some liaison with the Nazis and the Germans. You've got these people who've been duped or coerced into coming into this territory. Then you've got this pre-organized sort of institutional militarized operation for the occupation of Palestine. And then amongst all this is the British mandate and the British Empire itself, which is in charge. To what extent did they know about all of this?
Of course they knew. They were controlling Palestine. So without the British, the Haavara agreement, the transfer agreement, couldn't work. The British also demanded that each of those people coming will pay, to begin with, 500 sterling, and in the end, 1,000 sterling. So the British were also getting money out of the whole thing. So basically, the Jews of Europe were actually facing three organizations: the British Empire, the German growing empire, and the Zionist mini-empire, that took their money away in order to allow them to live. Of course, when they came to Palestine, they also were drafted into the army, not only in 48, but even before. The Haganah drafted quite a lot of them into the army. The army was illegal. The British didn't allow either Palestinians or Zionists to have militias. But while the Palestinians didn't have a militia, the Jews had three militias, and they knew about it. And until very late in the 30s, they didn't do anything about it. They even used those militias to fight the Palestinian rebellion in 1936, 1939.
Right.
Without the Haganah and the Irgun, the British will have a real problem defeating the Palestinians.
Right.
And just think about it. Most of the British army before the war was not in India, where the real problem was. It was in Palestine.
Sure.
So the British army was there for one reason alone, to have to support the colonial project. And of course, they saw, quite rightly, the colonial project as part of the British Empire.
So there was clear intent to leave behind this entity, which would be a foothold for
Definitely.
the empire in dealing with West Asia, which had oil, which they knew very well had oil, and perhaps this was what the intent was.
Yeah, I mean, that was the foothold that they could trust. They couldn't trust a foothold in Egypt, as it turned out. They couldn't trust Transjordan, or, the Arabia, different tribes. That is the one that they trusted, despite the fact that the Zionist forces have been terrorizing the British for a good 10 years before 1940.
So it calls into question the morality of the British state at that time and the empire, in terms of almost being complicit in the assassination and the killing of their own citizens, their own soldiers.
I would remove almost from that sentence. I mean, the British Empire started the systemic support of Zionism in 1916, and it's the only country that has done so without a break for more than 100 years. So when people think that it's mainly the Americans who supported the Zionist project, they're wrong. It is Britain that gave continuous and unbroken support to Zionism.
So coming back to your father in all this, he's now drafted in the IDF. You're, as an 18-month-old child with your mother, trying to sort of make ends meet through this emerging political entity, which is obviously serving the purposes of empire. What was it like growing up in that period?
Well, I was ill most of the time because the prison was very badly providing for babies. Obviously, it wasn't designed. So I was very ill and almost died in the prison. My father was freed at the end of the war, the end of the summer, in the autumn of 1948. He came to the prison to take us. He was told where we are. And he found, or was allocated, a Palestinian flat in Jaffa, in a part of Jaffa, the modern part of Jaffa.
Tel Aviv.
Not in Tel Aviv, no.
Okay,
in a Palestinian town. No Israelis lived there. The Irgun took it over very brutally, and the whole population of this town, which was like the modern part of Jaffa, the south of Jaffa, a lot of Bauhaus buildings, really modern, very delightful, on the sea. And most of the Palestinians were ejected, 95 or more % were ejected, expelled.
This is all part of the Nakba, or is it slightly?
Yeah, it was part of the Nakba. It was in April, before Israel became a state. They didn't wait. Most of the Palestinians were already out of Palestine when Israel became a state. Yeah, so they used immediately after the UN resolution passed, they started the war against the Palestinians. There was no one to protect the Palestinians there. Jaffa, Safed, Tiberias, Haifa, the main cities fell before the beginning of the State of Israel. And people don't realize that 2/3 of the Palestinians were already out of their homes and out of Palestine by May 1948. The main thing to say about this town called Jabalia is that two things. First of all, Jabalia in Gaza
It's being bombed, even now. It's one of the main points of attack.
Yeah, it's called Jabalia in Gaza because these are the people of Jabalia in Jaffa.
They came from Jaffa. I see the connection.
Went on.
They were refugees.
Jabalia was also a place where there were boats because it was a fishing port.
I see.
So they just went on those fishing boats. A lot of them died, but most of them arrived to Gaza and built Jabalia, which was basically a refugee camp. So the only two types of people lived in Jabalia in 1948 and, the years after. No Israelis, two types of survivors, people who survived the camps in Europe and survivors of the Nakba. They lived together peacefully, humanely, interestingly, without any friction, political, social friction. They lived together. And actually, what is even more interesting is that in the first 2 years of Israel, the legislation demanded that where Palestinians were more than a certain percent of the local population, Arabic is taught together with Hebrew. So we were taught very badly Arabic and Hebrew, but we knew Arabic from the street because we played together. We didn't know there was anything wrong with the Palestinian children until we went to school.
Right.
And then they started that kind of, the racism started to be systemic. So
it was actually taught in the education programs.
There were only 3 places like this in Israel, that Palestinians were above a certain percentage of the population. Haifa, Jaffa, and Ramle.
Okay.
So in those places, the children learned Arabic, nowhere else. Yeah, but these places were not part of Israel. The only Israelis there were the teachers. Even the doctors, the nurses in the health clinic, the people who owned shops, and they were all survivors.
Right.
So this was not a preparation for Israel, because the place was disregarded. It didn't get anything from the government.
Right.
Really, we didn't exist.
Because it didn't conform or fit the kind of model that they had everywhere else.
We were an oddity, and they tried to get people out of those places later on, but we stayed there until 1960.
And then at some stage you were conscripted, as all citizens there.
Yeah, because my father was a refuser, he was one of the first ones, maybe the first one.
Yeah.
I didn't know about that. So had I known about that, my life would be, in a sense, simpler, because I didn't want to go to the army. I wasn't politicized, but I thought, I don't want to be a soldier. I don't even know why. But our home was not wasn't a nationalist home. My uncle, that is part of my education, was a communist, and he fought in Russia against the Nazis as a partisan. 2 of my uncles on my father's side died as partisans. So there was a different atmosphere in the whole place, but definitely in our home.
Well, you also mentioned earlier on about how your mother's side was more Zionist and your father's side was anti-Zionist. How did that start playing out once you were in, occupied Palestine,
It's
Israel?
Interesting, both my mother's brother and sister lived in Palestine since the 1931. So they lived in a settlement. It's called Moshava, which is the Hebrew for settlement. Yeah, so they didn't invent new words. They called it the colonial, the term was used, settlement.
It was already there.
Yeah. So they lived in a settlement called Rehovot, which is now a town, and actually excelled themselves by not helping up parents during the Holocaust. Now, you would have thought that it was impossible to do anything, but that's actually not true, because the mail went to Poland and back during the war.
Wow.
Don't ask me how they organized this. And even between Russia and Poland, which were on two sides of an enemy line, there was mail going. So my communist uncle sent as much as he could, mainly butter, I think, and flour, to the ghetto. And we found a letter that he wrote in Yiddish, and I speak Yiddish, and he said in 1940, he wrote a letter to the two in Palestine. And he said to them, look, we don't have much in the Soviet Union. We're under terrible conditions, but I do my best to send them because they are existing on nothing in the ghetto. Please, what you can do, send them, save your family from starvation. They never did. And when we found the letter, I asked my uncle, why did you not at least send a letter? And he said, do you think we didn't have problems here? We had to fight the British. And so basically they didn't care. Because they were Zionists, those people were, because they were not Zionists, they were anti-Zionists and didn't want to come to Palestine. They might as well perish because,
So there was a real
if they
divide.
did what we told them, they would be here. They didn't. And now they're under the Nazis. Let them eat what they can. So this, actually, as a child, I didn't know that. We found that letter when I was 28 or something like that. But what I did know is that my uncle and my aunt, the Israelis, we did talk about them as the Israeli uncle, and because we had other people who were not Israeli.
Yeah.
They didn't
Them
want
in
to
America,
know.
etc. Yeah.
They didn't want to know anything. My parents were not of the silent type. They wanted to talk about what happened because they wanted people to know. They wanted to speak for the dead. Yeah, they were speakers for the dead. And they wanted to tell because they thought that's why we survived. We survived to tell the tale. Those people didn't want to know. Another thing, I'm going quickly through it, but another thing was Yiddish, which was the first language of my parents and also my first language, was basically a language which was banned in Israel in many ways. For example, you could not have a film or theater production in Yiddish.
So they were pushing Hebrew to try and get everybody.
Yeah, but a third of the population was survivors from the camps, and their language was Yiddish, for God's sake. So the only language which carried 100% tax on the paper it was printed on was Yiddish. Even Arabic did not carry the tax. So if you wanted to read the main Yiddish paper, which my parents, by the time they knew how to read Hebrew properly and found it necessary to do that, that was years after. When they came, they only knew Hebrew from the prayer book. So they needed to read Yiddish. And they bought it, and it was very expensive because it was double the price of any other paper. But that was their language. In a novel that I've written about this period, there is a chapter where we're going to see a production of Hamlet in Yiddish. It's a comedy, by the way. And I didn't see the end because the police raided, it was illegal. So the police raided it, and we all ran away, and my father carried me on his back. And I said, now I will never know what happened to Hamlet,
Yeah.
And I didn't for many years.
Yeah.
So that was how they treated the culture, the language, the tradition of Jews from Europe. They were dismissive and hostile.
Well, that's really interesting because now, with people like Benjamin Netanyahu, I think his name is Milkovich, is it?
Milkovsky.
Yeah, I should have known that. But Milkovsky, and he's of Polish origin. So essentially, he is Yiddish, and in fact, it was the founders of Zionism made it clear that the Yid was different from the Jew in Palestine. So it's a fascinating area. Perhaps we haven't got time to explore that in detail just now, but it's almost now being turned on its head, where a lot of people who are anti-Israel will say, "Oh, well, these are all imported, Jews from Eastern Europe, and they're the ones to blame." Where in reality, what you're painting is this picture of a political movement which was using both the Yids and I guess the traditional Jews or whatever who were from Palestine, and those who were imported from elsewhere.
Few of them were from Palestine. It was a very small community before the 20th century.
Right.
Very small community living in peace and harmony in Jerusalem, in Safed, in Tiberias, and Jaffa, like Jews lived everywhere in the Middle East, in Muslim countries.
Yeah. Iraq and Iran and elsewhere.
There was no, I'm not talking about Holocaust, there were no pogroms, there was no anti-Semitism. It was totally unknown.
It's also mooted that the Jews in Iraq, the exodus from Iraq was because terror acts were initiated by
it's not mooted. They admitted it. I mean, the person who threw the bomb gave, one of them gave the evidence in a recent book by Avi Schleim, who is telling the story about his family in Baghdad. He quotes the person who was a member of his family. So there's no doubt that, all of a sudden, bombs supposedly by Muslims with Arabic script accusations are starting to explode. And of course, they caught those three local Jews, and they were killed. What happened in Baghdad is really terrifying, because Baghdad is the oldest diaspora of Judaism. It went back almost 3,000 years. The Jews of Baghdad were the richest and most important Jewish diaspora ever. They wrote the Talmud. They wrote the Mishnah. They wrote the most important text in Judaism. They were a very well-established community. They had the first Jewish universities 2,600 years ago. There were no universities anywhere then. Yeah. So what we're talking about is the real Iraqis. Those Jews were the real Iraqis. They are there before the Arabs came. They are there before the Muslims came, of course.
So Babylon and all that kind of old ancient history.
They are the only people remaining from 3,000 years ago. So this was a community that didn't want to leave Baghdad. Baghdad was its home. They had a chance for almost 3,000 years to go to Palestine. They were free to do so. They didn't want to do that. They were Iraqis, or whatever they called themselves. They called themselves Baghdadis, although there were some of them in Basra. So the destruction of this diaspora was very important to the Israelis, because it carried so much weight historically. And when the bombs started going off in a Jewish hospital, synagogues, a Jewish cultural center, and so on, they left leaflets in Arabic that the Jews are hated and they should leave. The government was new, actually, because there was a coup when it happened in 1950. And the government didn't want the Jews to leave, because they were doctors, they were lawyers, they were
professionals who were driving economies and businessmen. Probably.
It was a terrible thing. There are 160,000 of them. There was not 200, yeah? There was 160,000.
That kind of a community still exists in Iran. I think it's well over,
Of course,
maybe 100,000, perhaps more, Isfahan and all over. So there's a,
it's the
they're
same
still
entrenched. It's the same type.
But in Iraq, it got wiped out?
Oh, totally, yeah, totally. I mean, what happened is, I don't think the people wanted to leave, but Israel basically told the Iraqi regime that was still organizing itself, that it will take the Jews off its hands. And they sent, rented aircraft, I think, from different companies because they didn't have them. So they rented those and sent them to Baghdad with the Jewish pilots, Israeli pilots. And the community, at the beginning, the government said, don't leave. We don't want you to leave. These bombs were put in by Israeli agents. We caught the agents. We're going to put them on trial. And they did put them on trial. And it was, not a short trial because it was difficult. But in the end, they got the death penalty for killing people, Jewish people. So they tried not to kill people, but in the end, one of them died because the bomb went on in his trouser pocket. They were not really professional about the way they did it and so on. So in the end, the Jews left.
So they
not
achieved
willingly. I mean, Avi Schleim tells the story very beautifully about how his father refused to leave and he stayed. And he died in Baghdad. He didn't want to.
Well, it seems old habits die hard because Benjamin Netanyahu and the IDF and Mossad are accused of doing all sorts of these things in order to maintain the Israeli, if you like, entity across the world. I mean, the whole notion of anti-Semitism, the notions of scaring governments, Western governments, into making sure that Israel gets the exceptionalism it wants. It seems like a lot of these actions are rooted in the very origins of the creation.
Here they talked about a community that did not suffer from anti-Semitism, actually didn't know the word. The term didn't mean anything in Arabic, and yet they blamed anti-Semitism that didn't exist. They were the anti-Semites throwing the bombs.
Yes. So the Zionists.
Imagine, you couldn't make it up.
Yeah,
They did the same in Egypt. They did the same in Tunisia. So, that was a method.
So sort of dirty tactic to actually just get the place, because they would need people to drive the nation. I mean, again, coming back to your experience, you joined the IDF. Of course, it was you had to, because everybody, I think, goes into the military at one stage. What was that all like?
I could possibly have... there was only one person before my time that refused to join. One person. So there was already an example. But I was 17 and a half. I was very immature. Had I known that my father was a refuser, I think that would have given me some kind of, backbone. Sure. But I didn't know that for years.
It's a very young age.
So in the end, I went into the army and tried not to join anything. And by, they made me agree to become an officer by saying to me, that's the kind of people like you that we need in the army to keep it moral, to keep it a moral army, unlike other armies. And I was stupid enough to listen to it.
Yeah, it's a persuasive argument that you could make a difference on the inside.
Exactly.
Basically. Yeah.
And of course, you can't make a difference on the inside. Never. But that was the argument that they gave people like me. Yes, because you don't want to be in the army, because you don't want to see violence, because you don't want to see that in a Jewish army. That's why we need people like you.
Right.
And I bought into it.
And how long did you serve in?
I served almost 4 years because towards the end of my service, there was the 1967 war. So then they added a year to our service I was already an officer, so almost near 4 years in the army.
How do you think it's changed, the IDF at that time and what you see today? Because, of course, in your journey, you went from being an Israeli citizen, an IDF member, and this transition to becoming an anti-Zionist, somebody who doesn't approve of Israel in its current form, and who regards the IDF presumably as a genocidal terrorist force now. How have you seen the evolution of all that?
Well, I don't think that I ever liked the idea of being in the army, so I didn't need a lot of persuasion, against the idea of an army and a Jewish army and an occupation army. After 1967 starts a new age of occupation of the whole of Palestine for the first time, over all Palestinians in Palestine, very brutal. I immediately felt uneasy, but I wasn't political. I was not politicized. I was not anti-Zionist. And I think if I stayed in Israel, it'll take me a much longer period. But I decided to go to Britain and do postgraduate studies in theatre, which is in film. Right. So I went to London in 1972. And within a very short time, I joined the only anti-Zionist organization in reality then, which was an Israeli organization and had a London branch.
What was it called?
Matzpen.
Matzpen. Okay.
Matzpen is basically, it's a compass, but it's also the word that gives consciousness, is matzpun, which comes from Matzpen. So it's someone with a direction.
Right.
Yeah. So Matzpen was an organization of anti-Zionists. And when we said in London that we're anti-Zionists, people didn't know that there are any anti-Zionists.
Wow.
There are only 10 of us in London.
Goodness.
And we knew each other, and we didn't go into the same taxi just in case something happens, and there are no anti-Zionists. Yeah. So that was a joke.
So it was a threat even then, yeah.
But now we have millions of anti-Zionists. It was unthinkable at the time, because we did say Israel was genocidal in 1948, and since Israel is an apartheid state, Israel is committing war crimes every day, and people on the left in Britain could not accept this. But there was more freedom of speech then. I spoke in every single university, I think, and so did my colleagues.
What was the tipping point for you to becoming an anti-Zionist?
The tipping point was a year after I arrived in Britain, and there was an attack. Israel, the method of taking parts of Palestine and making them Arab-Rhine, without Arabs,
yes.
Is to make them into shooting ranges. It's called a shooting zone number. They give it a number, and it's huge. It's between all the villages. They make a shooting range. So everyone that had, land there is losing it. They're not paid. They're just losing the land. I'm talking about the 60s or even the 50s. So they make most of Palestine into shooting ranges. Once the army operates there for a couple of years, they annex it, and make it a Jewish area. And then the army leaves and they build a Jewish village or two or three.
So once you made this transition, you're obviously cutting your ties in a way with the mainstream who have bought into the idea of Israel being, the democracy in the Middle East, the force which is saving Jewry all over the world.
I believed that until I left Israel. And then I started reading history, reading Zionist history, yeah, and anti-Zionist history, and it was clear to me that there was never a democracy in Palestine.
How did that go down with your communities, the people you did know? I mean, the Jews in Britain, for instance, where you'd come.
I had no links with the Jews in Britain.
So it was easier for you to...
Yeah, all my friends were left, of center and, radical, as part of, radical movements of the left. I couldn't relate to the Jews in Britain because they were supporting, all of a sudden, they were supporting Israel after 1967 because of the victory. So this was also a militarized support. It wasn't a support for cultural reasons. It was supporting the victors that took over the whole of Palestine. It was all the wrong reasons. I couldn't relate to those
So it's
people.
almost like that triggered the victory of Zionism and Israel over the diaspora and got a stronger grip.
The diaspora was Zionized. The first people that were Zionized and occupied, their minds were occupied, were the diaspora Jews. And now everyone is occupied by them. Our government is occupied, the French government, the US government, they're all occupied by Zionism. But at the time, it was mainly Jewish communities that were getting occupied.
And how are you treated when you do engage with those Jewish mindsets?
Well, you open your mouth and they beat you up to pulp. I mean, that happens so many times, it's not true. So
you're regarded maybe as a self-hating Jew?
Well, I never hate myself. I don't hate anybody. I am totally against
least of all yourself.
But Jews don't hate themselves more than other people. And I don't think anyone who is called a Jew a self-hater is hateful. The only people who are hateful are Zionist Jews, in my experience. The Palestinians in Gaza, when they speak, they don't speak with hate. They speak with pain. They speak with anger. They speak, I think, with courage, with, a lot of insight. They don't speak with racism. They don't speak with hatred. So I think this is a Zionist disease, if you want. It's a disease of the occupier.
Now, Haim, the world after the genocide in Gaza is very different in the way it looks at Zionists, and perhaps the way it looks at Jews as well. There is, of course, now a much freer language going across social media, which is borderline anti-Semitic, I would say, but it's also actually looking more deeply at the exceptionalism of Israel and Jews generally and Zionists for sure. You're witnessing this, and some of it I'm sure that you agree with, and some of it, of course, one is worried about, because the fine line between, becoming a hateful anti-Semite and someone who's just against Zionism is also now quite blurred, because the government and Israel and its diaspora is using a lot of this kind of sentiment to castigate those people who are genuinely after Palestinian liberation or want justice around the world and are worried about the power of Israel. How do you see today the situation of the Jewish diaspora in particular, and what their responsibility should be in terms of Zionism?
It's a terrifying picture, totally terrifying, because more Jews than at any other point in time are now anti-Zionist, and some of them are leading the movement against Israel. So that's great. We just had an anti-Zionist Jewish Congress in Vienna, which I was one of the organizers. We had 1,100 Jews there, 3 days. We're organizing the second one in Ireland for next year. We're talking about more than a third of the Jews in Britain now being anti-Zionist. This was unthinkable. This was really unthinkable. But these are not just anti-Zionists. They are part of the left, the radical left in Britain. They are progressive on all the counts. The main issue for most of us is the growth of Islamophobia. And the growth of Islamophobia is an Israeli phenomenon that Europe has taken over, and the United States has taken over. Most of the leading Islamophobe theorists were Zionists. I would say the great majority of them. So what has happened is not overnight. It didn't start on the 7th of October. It started in the new millennium. People understood that what we have in Palestine is a settler colonial state which uses the worst model of colonialism, settler colonialism. It uses terribly sadistic and cruel methods of emptying Palestine of its citizenship. So what has happened is the change started. It's the same in the United States, not so in France, but the same in the United States. They even lead us in terms of percentage. Most of young Jews in the United States are anti-Zionists. Thank God for that. So, I mean, God is not involved. The Israelis have made those anti-Zionists. Their behavior has made those anti-Zionists. And I want to say another thing about that. In the 2,000 years the Jews lived in Europe, since the destruction of the temple, they were not involved in violence of any kind unless it was violence against them. The same is true about the Jews of the Arab world. Their life were even more peaceful. They did not suffer from anti-Semitism.
Sure.
So Jews have kept their distance from violent methods, not necessarily by choice, but by conditions. Conditions meant they did not have a chance to use violence, and they did not use violence. Violence was not normalized in Jewish society. I'm not saying that Jews were better than others. Please don't misunderstand me. I'm just saying they were not
in a position to be able to.
So, and you know, when you're in a position to use violence and you use violence, you become violent. So, what Zionism demanded from those Jews when they came to Palestine is to become violent, to become the agents, the physical agents of violence of Zionism. And a lot of the diaspora Jews bought into this. They went and served there. Even in Gaza, there were a few thousand people from Britain. Some of them are still serving there. So what they did is they wouldn't even do if they were in the British Army. Yeah, because the British Army, on the whole, does not commit genocide, but, you know, the IDF does. So what I'm saying is, the history and culture and tradition of Judaism is non-violent, not because they were peace lovers, but because it didn't happen. You know, it couldn't happen. And now we have one of the most, if not the most violent communities on earth, being Jewish and committing genocide. So if before anti-Semitism had to invent, you know, Jews drink blood for Passover and all kind of total nonsense, you know, I mean,
dehumanized, rubbish, yes.
In order to justify Jew hatred, now you don't need to look for anything. Just go to YouTube and look at what they do. They blow up a university as a gift to their wife's birthday or a little girl's birthday. They destroy a hospital for the wedding day, you know, and they put this online, and they are very proud and they're full of glee when the whole thing goes up. And, you know, this is not just a bomb goes up in smoke, people are going up in smoke. For Jews to do that is the worst thing they could do, because that is now fueling a new wave of anti-Semitism, which this time is based on facts. It's not based on memes of anti-Semitism. It is based on the facts that Israel has normalized. That it is normal to kill people. All the people in Gaza are fair game. If they are not terrorists yet, they will be because they just weren't born. You know, all that kind of language did not exist when I was in the army. So there is a great change, not just in the diaspora, but in the Israeli army, which is now religionized. It's a nationalistic neo-Nazi army that justifies, and who justifies? The rabbis in the army are justifying the killing of babies in Gaza. That is something that Judaism has never seen in its many thousands of years of history. It is disgusting, it is terrifying, and Jews that actually go along with that make a very bad mistake for all of us, because if there is anti-Semitism, which is rabid, nobody will ask me what my politics is. You support Palestine, you can go away. You don't support Palestine, I'm gonna, harm you. Yeah. Then all Jews become fair game because most of them are supporting what is happening in Gaza. This is a terrible thing. And that's why those of us who are anti-Zionists are trying to convert those diaspora communities as soon as possible. And we couldn't do it on our own without the help from Israel. Israel and its actions are creating anti-Zionists of all of us, Jews, Christians, Muslims.
So what is your last message, as we're coming to the end of the program, to Jews in specific about the current situation?
We want diaspora Jews to be what they always have been. They have been part and parcel of the most radical and sometimes, the most humane part of those societies. They were socialists, they were humanists, they were for freedom of speech, they were for freedom of thought, they were in all the main movements. Of course, not all Jews were, Jews were very central to capitalism as well. But Jewish society on the whole was progressive because their freedom depended on arguing for freedom for others.
Yes.
So we want them to abandon Zionism and Israel lock, stock, and barrel, because nothing in Judaism is supporting this. Judaism is not supporting genocide, is not supporting apartheid, and we wish that they all abandon this toxic tradition that Zionism has instigated and join the part of society where they belong. Yeah. The New York Jews in the beginning of the 20th century were the most radical people in New York. That is now happening again. And that should happen in every Jewish society. They should actually totally reject the Judaism, the so-called Judaism of Israel. Israel is not a Jewish state. What they're doing is anti-Jewish, is anti-human, is against the future. It's against society. So that's our message is now, to build, like apartheid, anti-apartheid in the 70s and 80s, to build an anti-Zionist tradition, movement of Jews and others and people of no religion whatsoever. We all should be united in an anti-Zionist movement that will bring the end of Zionism.
Well, Professor Haim Bresheeth, thank you so much for sharing such a personal story, such a touching journey through your own personal life, your family, and connecting it to the realities of our modern geopolitics, and also for the message to the Jewish fraternity, who definitely are now on a stage, on a global stage, where I guess all eyes are on them. And there are people like Sheldon Adelson and his wife, who he's died, but his wife Miriam are fully behind the Zionist movement. There are many, many others who are taking a front stage and are giving, I guess, Jewry a bad name, and giving the whole notion of Judaism a bad name, and connecting the Judaism to this violent genocidal state. And I guess it's a down to people like yourself who are beginning to stand up against that and have been for so many years, that I guess the world has hope. There is hope. There's a possibility. And it's not to say that the Jewish community has the primary responsibility to rein in Israel, but I think certainly it has a major role, and I think you've outlined a fantastic manifesto there, and we wish you success in the work you do, and to all the other Jewish brothers and sisters who are in this kind of movement. To the audience, it's been a really absolutely mind-blowing analysis and look and an insight into genuine Jewish minds. And I think to people who are out there who are shifting towards an anti-Semitic stance, it gives you, I think, food for thought, that we need to stop with the stereotypes, we need to look at things with nuance, and we need to understand the difference between Zionism and Judaism. We understand the difference also. Within the Jewish community, there is a huge problem with Zionism, which is growing. And I think that long may that continue. And certainly what we all need is a collective human civilizational dream and a vision. And the Abrahamic dream certainly gives us that. And that the true Jews, the true Muslims, the true Christians all share, I think, that prophetic dream, which is rooted in Abrahamic faith, and it has nothing to do with terrorism or terrorist states or empires or imperialism as we're seeing today. My thanks once again to Professor Haim Bresheeth, and until the next edition of Deep Dive Perspective, do please hit that share, like and subscribe button so that we can get these kinds of honest voices and voices of sanity and justice and human civilization to you more and more, because the mainstream increasingly doesn't do this.